An elderly couple overheard their nephew arranging the sale of land that wasn't yet his, drove out to the orchard the same night, and by the time anyone came looking for them, the cider press was already running. Ruth Calloway had been teaching piano since 1979. The upright she taught on was a 64-key Kawai that had been in the front room of her house on Milner Road since Gerald had carried it through the door in 1983. And in 44 years of lessons, it had been played by the tentative fingers of children who would never amount to musicians, and by the careful fingers of a handful who would. Ruth could tell the difference from the first lesson. She did not tell the parents what she heard, because that was not her job. Her job was to teach the child in front of her, not to predict them. She was 71 years old. She had been married for 48 years. She had taught 294 students. She had lived in Dunmore, Oregon, in the same house since 1976. And in that time, she had learned what the valley looked like in every season and in every kind of light. And she had learned that the things worth having were almost always the things that required patience. Gerald Calloway was 74. He had spent 36 years as a master arborist for Lane County before his retirement at 68, and in those years, he had assessed, pruned, cabled, felled, and planted more than 4,000 trees across a 12-county service area. He knew the biology of trees the way a doctor knows the body, not as a collection of facts to be consulted, but as a living system whose logic he understood instinctively. He could read the crown of a fruit tree from a moving car. He could tell the difference between a tree that was dormant and a tree that was declining, and the difference was not always visible to anyone else. His hands had done this work for so long that the knowledge lived in them as much as in his head, and retirement had not changed that. The knowledge simply had fewer places to go. They had 2 adult children. Their son Dennis was 44 and worked in commercial real estate brokerage in Portland. Their daughter Patrice was 42 and worked as a hospital administrator in Salem. They had 5 grandchildren between them, ranging in age from 7 to 15, who came to Milner Road at Thanksgiving and at Christmas, and who called in the weeks between when they needed help with something. Ruth and Gerald were people with a long life behind them, and, they had believed, a clear enough life ahead. The orchard had belonged to Ruth's father, before it belonged to anyone else in this story. Alden Marsh had been a school teacher in Elkton, Oregon for 33 years, teaching 6th grade at the same school where he had himself been a student. He had planted 76 apple trees on 11 acres of land east of the Umpqua River in the spring of 1961, not the whole 11 acres, but the south-facing slope that got the afternoon sun and drained well. He had chosen 11 varieties for their pressing characteristics rather than their shelf life. Foxwhelp, Kingston Black, Yarlington Mill, Chisel Jersey, Brown Snout, Stoke Red, Ellis Bitter. They were cider apples, most of them astringent and tannic and of no great use at a grocery store, but capable, when pressed and fermented with patience, of producing something that tasted specifically of where they grew. Alden Marsh was not a commercial orchardist. He planted those trees because they interested him. He had never fully gotten the press operation running in the way he had imagined. He died in January 2001 at the age of 76, and he left the 11 acres and the equipment barn and the house to Ruth in a will written in October 1994, which was clear in its language and which had never been contested. Ruth had paid the property taxes on that land for 27 years. She had driven out twice each summer, once in June, once in August, to check the fence lines, the pump, and the trees, which had grown progressively more overgrown since the last managed harvest in 2009. She had never been quite ready to let it go. She had told herself, it was grief, the way you leave a thing in place, because touching it is difficult. But grief was not the whole answer. The whole answer was that the land was her father's specific intention, the trees he had chosen, the varieties he had sought out from nurseries in England and Wales, the equipment he had tracked down and purchased and installed. The land was his plan for something that had not quite happened, and Ruth could not release it. That was the first thing her nephew, Craig Marsh, had counted on. Craig Marsh was 41 years old and ran a property acquisition and brokerage company in Eugene called Marsh Capital Group. He was Alden Marsh's great-nephew by marriage, not by blood. The connection ran through his mother's second husband, a man named Robert Marsh, whose relation to Alden had been a third-cousin situation that no one had ever fully verified. Craig had legally adopted the name Marsh at 22, for reasons that were probably practical. He had attended Alden's funeral in January 2001 in a three-piece suit that was more expensive than the occasion warranted. And he had shaken Ruth's hand at the reception and said that Alden had been a remarkable man. He had been 21 at the time, and Ruth had thought he was very polished for his age. She had not thought much more about him until the conversation she heard on the Tuesday in April. He had been in contact with Dennis and Patrice for approximately 8 months before Ruth and Gerald knew anything about it. This came out later, in pieces, the way things always come out, not in a single revelation, but in the accretion of small details that, assembled, told the shape of what had been planned. Craig had approached Dennis first, in the summer of the previous year, with what he described as a professional observation that the Elkton property was significantly underutilized, that there was a developer in Eugene with an interest in rural residential acreage, and that the smart move would be to let Craig facilitate a sale before the county revaluation in the spring. He told Dennis that Ruth and Gerald were at an age where simplifying their assets made sense. He told Dennis that the proceeds from the sale could be managed in a way that supported them without requiring them to make any difficult decisions themselves. Dennis had listened. He was a real estate man, and the logic was familiar to him. He brought Patrice in. Patrice was a hospital administrator who managed complexity for a living and had applied that management capacity to her parents' affairs in ways that were not always comfortable, but which she justified to herself as being practical. She had not discussed any of it with Ruth or Gerald. Craig had a developer lined up. He had a preliminary site plan. He had a legal structure he had used before for exactly this type of transaction, which required only that Dennis and Patrice establish power of attorney over their parents' financial interests. Something Craig had described as straightforward. Something families did all the time. The timeline he had set was before the county tax assessment, updated in March. That was the window. Ruth heard the word window through the kitchen door at 11:15 on a Tuesday night in April. She had come downstairs because her hip was grinding, and she knew from experience that lying still made it worse. She had stopped in the hallway because Dennis's voice was wrong, tighter than his normal voice, lower, the voice he used when he was in the middle of something he had not told anyone about. She heard, "He's already got a buyer for the development rights. The house site plan is ready." A pause. Dennis listening. "Yeah, she's not going to fight it. She doesn't really, you know how she gets. She'll see it's the right move." Another pause. Craig said March. "Before the county records the new assessment. That's the window." A shorter pause. I know. But it's 11 acres, Patrice. Nobody's been out there in years. It's just sitting there. She's not going to do anything with it." Ruth stood in the hallway for 4 more minutes. She did not move. Her hip did not bother her. She noted the tone of the conversation, which was the tone of people who have been discussing something for long enough that the guilt has been smoothed over by repetition. She noted that Dennis had said she's not going to fight it, rather than she won't want to sell it, which told her he had already moved past the question of whether she would agree to the sale and was now working on the assumption that she would not need to. She went back upstairs. She lay down beside Gerald in the dark. She listened to him breathe, a slow, even rhythm she had been listening to for 48 years, and she stared at the ceiling and thought. She was not particularly angry, or she was, but it was underneath something that felt more like clarity. Gerald woke at 5:30, the way he always did, and found her already awake. "How long have you been up?" he said. "A while," Ruth said. She told him everything she had heard, in the order she had heard it, without interruption and without interpretation. Gerald listened the way he listened, very still, looking at the ceiling, letting the words arrive in sequence. When she finished, he said, "When did Craig get added to the deed?" "He wasn't," Ruth said. "Then he's arranging a sale he can't close." "Not until Dennis and Patrice establish power of attorney," Ruth said. "Which is what they're working toward," Dennis said before March. "The county assessment is in March." Gerald lay still for a moment. "We need to see the orchard," he said. "I know." "Today," he said. "I know," Ruth said. They told the children they were going to Medford for the weekend to visit the Kesslers. They had been friends with the Kesslers for 31 years, and this was a plausible and unverifiable claim. Dennis called on Thursday to check in, and Ruth answered and said the drive down had been fine. She did not feel particularly guilty about this, which she noted and set aside. Ruth and Gerald drove to Elkton in the Subaru, with the rear seat folded flat and 3 coolers, Gerald's work bag, a toolbox, his loppers, a chainsaw, and 4 boxes of material Ruth had quietly assembled over the preceding 3 days. Her teaching records, the files from her personal desk drawer, the documents relating to the Elkton property that she kept in a folder at the back of her filing cabinet. She had taken those documents out not because she expected to need them immediately, but because she was not going to leave them somewhere they could be accessed while she was away. They arrived at the Elkton property at 3:20 in the afternoon. The access road had not been graded since 2018. Blackberry canes had grown across the first 30 feet of the driveway, and Gerald had to get out with the loppers and clear a path wide enough for the car. The fences were intact, but the gate had seized with rust and required the bolt cutters to open. The equipment barn's sliding door had dropped off its upper rail and stood at an inward angle, leaving a gap at the top and creating a small dark triangle at the base where something had been nesting. The pump house had a cracked section on the north foundation wall, roughly 18 inches long, which was letting in water. Gerald could tell from the staining on the block below it and the state of the ground immediately adjacent. The house was standing. It was a 4-room farmhouse, built in 1947, which Alden Marsh had purchased along with the 11 acres in 1959 and spent the following 3 years finishing to his satisfaction. Concrete block foundation, cedar siding that had weathered to a pale gray, metal roof, heavier gauge than most people would have chosen, because Alden Marsh had believed in buying material you would not have to replace. He had been right. The roof was the reason the house had survived. Everything beneath it had stayed dry. Gerald walked through every room before he said anything. He checked the floor joists from the crawl space with a flashlight, pressing on them at intervals, listening to how they responded. He tested the sills by running his thumb along the grain. He stood at the load-bearing wall between the kitchen and the front room and pressed his palm flat against the plaster and pushed. He went outside and walked the full perimeter of the foundation, stopping at each corner, crouching at the northeast corner where the grade had shifted and the soil had pulled away from the block. Ruth stood in the kitchen. The wallpaper was peeling at the seams. a vertical yellow stripe pattern that she remembered from visiting here as a child, in the years when her father was still teaching and the house smelled of wood smoke and coffee. The linoleum was intact, worn at the threshold but not broken. Her father's coffee tin was on the shelf above the sink, the same tin, the same label, the same red and gold Folgers design from before they changed it, which put it before 1963 at least. She lifted it down. It was empty. It weighed almost nothing. She set it on the table. The kitchen window faced south. Through it, the orchard was visible in the afternoon light. Rows of trees in the middle distance, the branches crossing and tangling where years of unchecked growth had let them go into each other. But the bones of the planting were still there. The rows her father had laid out in 1961 were still the underlying architecture, visible if you knew where to look. She stood at the window and looked, and she was looking at something her father had put in the ground 60 years ago and which was still alive. When Gerald came back inside, he set his flashlight on the table next to the coffee tin. "Foundation is solid," he said. "The northeast corner needs to be regraded and sealed, but it's cosmetic. 6 hours of work. North wall of the pump house needs a section re-poured. I can do that. The joists are good. Sill has rot on the east side, maybe 6 feet of it. I'll replace 4 boards. Roof is fine." He paused. "The electrical is dated, but it's connected. I want to get the panel inspected before we use it." Ruth was still looking at the trees. "What about the orchard?" she said. Gerald came to stand beside her at the window. He looked at the trees for a moment without speaking. He was reading them the way he had spent 36 years reading trees, crown structure, branch angles, the overall silhouette that told you what a tree's years had been. "Neglected, not dead," he said. "The Foxwelps and Kingston Blacks are deep-rooted varieties. They don't give up easily." He squinted at a row to the left. "I'd say 14 trees need to come out. The rest can be brought back through corrective pruning. 2 full seasons of work. 3rd season, you'd have a commercial yield." Ruth turned from the window. "Then we start now," she said. That first night they slept on the floor of the front room in sleeping bags, with their coats over them, because the bed frames were there, but Ruth did not know where the mattresses had gone, and there was no time to source them. The temperature dropped to 41, and the house was cold, and through the walls they could hear the creak in the low field and, intermittently, something moving in the equipment barn. Ruth lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the creak and thought about her father planting those trees in 1961. The specific work of it, the stake driving and the hole digging and the root spreading, 60 trees put in the ground in a spring that had been cool and wet. And she thought about the 27 years she had paid the taxes on this land and come out twice a summer to check that it was still there. She slept better than she had expected to. Over the following 14 days, Ruth and Gerald made 6 additional trips to Elkton, while the children believed them to be at home on Milner Road, occupied with ordinary retirement. The cover was not complicated. Dennis called twice, and Ruth answered, and said they were fine and busy. Patrice sent a text asking if they wanted to come for Easter, and Ruth said they had plans. Neither child was watching the house in Dunmore closely enough to notice the Subaru was regularly gone. Gerald ordered materials through a supplier account he had kept active since his county employment days, and had them delivered to the equipment barn address in Elkton, which required him to be present for the deliveries, which meant he was at the property more than Ruth initially, but which suited him because it meant he was also in the orchard every morning. He replaced the east sill boards himself over 2 visits, working off a scaffold he had built from lumber he found on site. He mixed the hydraulic cement for the pump house wall in a wheelbarrow that had been in the barn since at least 2003 and which still held water. which he considered a good sign about the quality of the materials in this particular barn. Ruth's contribution to these 2 weeks was a list. It was 3 pages, written in her teaching handwriting, which was small and very precise from decades of fitting student assessments into narrow columns. The list was organized into 4 sections: what needed to be done to the house to make it livable, what needed to be done to the orchard before the end of the growing season, what legal steps needed to be taken and in what order, and what they were prepared to spend. On the last point, they had $47,000 in savings. Gerald's county pension was $1,340 a month. They received combined Social Security of $3,180 a month. They had no debt. They owned the Milner Roadhouse outright. They were not wealthy, and they were not desperate. And the specific numbers mattered, because Ruth believed that all significant decisions had to begin from accurate numbers rather than from general impressions about whether things would work out. On the 14th of April, Ruth called Sylvia Teague. Sylvia Teague was a property and land dispute attorney in Roseburg, whose name Ruth had found through the Oregon State Bar Directory, filtered for rural land experience. Her office had online reviews from farmers and timber families, and one very detailed review from a woman who had fought a county condemnation case for 3 years and won, which Ruth read carefully before she dialed. Ruth described the situation to Sylvia Teague in the same way she described everything important, chronologically, specifically, without editorializing. She described the conversation she had heard through the kitchen door. She described Craig Marsh's business model and his relationship to the family. She described the timeline Dennis had mentioned. She described the property's history, its title, and the condition in which she and Gerald had found it. Sylvia Teague listened without interrupting. Then she said, "The land is in your name." "Yes," Ruth said, "since my father's estate was settled in 2001. I have the deed. I have the title insurance. I have 27 years of tax receipts. And you have signed nothing, no power of attorney, no transfer document, nothing giving anyone else authority over the property. Nothing," Ruth said. "Then Craig Marsh has made representations to a developer about a sale he cannot close," Sylvia said. "Your children can establish power of attorney over your affairs only with your consent, and they have not obtained that consent. He has been arranging a transaction on a false premise. He assumed I would agree once it was in motion," Ruth said. "Or that I would find it easier to agree than to resist." Sylvia Teague was quiet for a moment. "That's a common miscalculation," she said. "What do we need to do? Occupy the property. Document that occupation with the county. Make the property visibly and demonstrably active before any transfer attempt is made. The county assessor's schedule is public. Their visit for your area is in May. You want to be on record as the active owner of an operational property before that visit." She paused. "Can you be out there by then?" "We're already there," Ruth said. Gerald walked the orchard on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of April with a field notebook and a set of marking flags. The same orange and white flags he had used for Lane County work, which he kept in his work bag out of habit. He moved row by row from the south end, working north, stopping at each tree and recording its condition in 3 columns: crown structure, trunk and root collar, estimated restoration category. He was 7 miles into the walk by the time he had covered all 76 trees. He had been on his feet since 6 in the morning, and it was after 4 when he came back to the house. He was not tired. He had missed this kind of work more than he had admitted to anyone, including Ruth. At dinner, he went through the notebook with her, tree by tree. 14 trees needed to come out. 3 had root rot. 4 had significant structural failures in the primary scaffold branches that could not be corrected through pruning. and 7 were too far compromised by the crossing damage of neighboring trees that had been allowed to grow into them unchecked. The remaining 62 were restorable. The majority of the damage was from lack of corrective pruning, branches that had crossed and rubbed over years until one defeated the other, heading growth that had run unchecked into the canopy above, water sprouts that had drawn energy away from the fruiting wood. These were all correctable. They were the kinds of problems that arose from absence, not from disease. "The foxwhelps are the best shape of the group," Gerald said. "Your father must have been pruning those himself in the last years. The Yarlingtons are bad. The Kingston Blacks are mixed. 8 of them are good. 3 are very good. 3 are a problem." He looked at his notes. "The 3 Kingston Blacks I want to take out are the ones at the west end of the planting. They're the ones that got the least sun. Everything else in that variety is salvageable." Ruth was doing her own calculations on the facing page of her notebook. "What's a realistic yield from 62 trees in year 3? She said. "If they're fully in corrective recovery by end of this season, and if year 2 goes as I expect, 350 gallons. Maybe 400. That's assuming good weather in both years." Ruth wrote the number down. They were still talking at 10 o'clock, which was later than either of them usually stayed up. Ruth noticed this and did not mention it. The table had the notebook and the pencils and the coffee tin, which had moved from the shelf to the table at some point and had become a permanent presence there, the way objects will when they belong to a place. Vernon Hatch arrived on a Thursday evening in the last week of April. He had been Alden Marsh's closest neighbor on the county road for 20 years. He farmed 8 acres of pears and hazelnuts a mile and a half west of the Elkton property, and he drove past the orchard driveway every time he went to town. He had noticed the gate was open in a different way than it had been open before. He had noticed the truck tracks in the mud of the access road. He had noticed the light in the farmhouse kitchen, which had not been lit in the evenings for as long as he could clearly remember. He drove in and knocked. Gerald came to the door with a flashlight. They were still not using the electrical pending the panel inspection. Vernon Hatch was a compact, deliberate man of 68, wearing a barn coat that had been washed so many times the color was indeterminate. He held his cap in his left hand. He said, "I was Alden's neighbor. I'm sorry to come without calling. I wanted to make sure everything was as it should be." Gerald said, "I'm Gerald Calloway. Alden's daughter is my wife." Vernon said, "Ruth." Ruth came to the door. Vernon Hatch looked at her with the particular expression of someone who knew the person they were looking at in a specific way, not from long acquaintance, but from having heard about them, from someone who had loved them. He said, "I haven't been on this property since the summer before Alden died. He wasn't well enough to have visitors after that." He paused. "He talked about you a great deal, about you coming back here." "Did he think we would?" Ruth said. Vernon Hatch looked at the orchard over their shoulders. "He hoped," he said. He couldn't know. He shifted his cap from one hand to the other. "There's something in the barn I think you need to know about. The press is in there. Alden's cider press. I helped him bring it in 1998. It's a rack and cloth hydraulic press, Austrian, 1962. It weighs 800 pounds and it has not been run since 2006, but your father maintained the mechanism. He was very particular about that. The seals were good when I last saw it." He paused. "I'm not sure anyone thought to tell you about it." Ruth looked at Gerald. Gerald said, "We didn't know about the press." Vernon Hatch nodded, as if this was what he had expected. "Then come out to the barn with me tomorrow," he said. "I'll show you what you've got." The press was everything Vernon had said it was and more than either of them had expected. It was a rack and cloth hydraulic press, a flexi press model from Villach, Austria, manufactured in 1962, which was the final decade of that class of press being built for small commercial operations, before stainless belt presses made them commercially unviable. Ruth's father had found it at an estate sale in Grants Pass in 1997, owned by the family of a man named Howard Luce, who had run a small cidery on 40 acres in Josephine County from 1954 to 1988. The press had been maintained by Howard Luce with the same care Alden Marsh had subsequently given it. The hydraulic seals were original and still good. You could tell because the mechanism moved cleanly when Vernon operated the hand pump, with no resistance and no weeping from the fittings. The pressing boards were stacked in a corner, flat and dry, in the order they would be assembled. There were 3 complete sets of pressing cloths in a sealed wooden box, and when Gerald lifted the lid of the box, the cloths were still white. Ruth stood in front of the press with her hand on the main frame. The frame was cold. It was solid in the way that old machined steel is solid, not just hard, but dense, with a weight and permanence that you felt through your palm. She stood there for a long moment. Gerald said, "Do you know what a rack and cloth press does to the tannin structure of a cider apple?" Ruth said, "Tell me." "It extracts differently than a belt press. Slower press, lower oxidation. The phenolics develop in a particular way. It's why the old English farmhouse ciders taste the way they do. They were all made on presses like this." He ran his hand along the hydraulic cylinder. "You can't buy this press anymore. You can't replicate what it does with modern equipment without spending $40,000–$50,000 and still not getting exactly this." Vernon Hatch was standing to one side. Alden knew that, he said. That's why he drove to Grants Pass for it. Ruth took her hand off the press frame. She said, "He always meant this." Gerald did not answer immediately. He was looking at the pressing boards, at the cloths in the box, at the hydraulic cylinder and the collection tray beneath it. "He meant something," Gerald said finally. "Whether it was exactly this, I don't know. He planted the right trees. He bought the right press. He left them both to you." He looked at Ruth. "What you do with that is yours to decide." Vernon Hatch looked at the two of them. "He would have been glad you came," he said. "That's all I know. If you've made it this far into Ruth and Gerald Calloway's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. By the 1st of May, they were living at the orchard full-time. The decision had not required a formal conversation. Gerald had said, one evening after the panel inspection was scheduled, that after Thursday they would have heat and light, and there was no practical reason to keep making the drive. Ruth had said that was true. Gerald had said they could bring the rest of what they needed over the weekend. Ruth had said that was a good idea. That had been the decision, made the way their significant decisions had always been made, without drama, in the interstices between other things, because 48 years of marriage produces a kind of operational shorthand in which the logistics of living do not require ceremony. They brought the mattresses from Milner Road and the kitchen things and Ruth's upright Kauai, which Gerald loaded into the back of a rented half-ton with the help of Vernon Hatch and a hand truck. The piano had not been moved since 1983. It was heavier than Gerald remembered. But it was in the front room of the Elkton farmhouse by 4 in the afternoon on a Saturday in early May, against the south wall where the light came in from the window. And that evening Ruth sat down and played a C major scale and listened to how the room took the sound. The room took it well. The plastered walls and the low ceiling and the old hardwood floor made a sound that was warmer and more present than the front room on Milner Road had ever been. Ruth sat for a moment after the scale resolved, and then she played the opening of a Schubert impromptu she had been teaching since 1984. And the piano sounded better in this room than it had in any room she could remember. Gerald was in the doorway listening. He did not say anything when she stopped. Dennis called on a Sunday morning. "We haven't heard much from you," he said. "We've been busy," Ruth said. "Busy with what? I thought you were in Medford." "We were. We're at the orchard now." There was a pause that lasted longer than it needed to. "The Elkton property," Dennis said. "Yes, Mom, there are some things we wanted to talk to you about that property." "I know," Ruth said. "Contact Sylvia Teague in Roseburg. She's our attorney of record for the Elkton property. I'll send you her number today." "Who is Sylvia?" "She handles rural land." "She knows the situation." Ruth was at the kitchen window, looking at the orchard in the morning light. "Dennis, we're living here now. We're running the orchard. Craig Marsh arranged a sale on land he has never owned and that I have never offered to sell. You should understand what that exposure looks like before you have any further contact with him." The call ended shortly after that. Ruth stood at the window for a while after she put the phone down. The trees were in early morning light, cool, green, the canopies opening up in ways that had not been visible 2 weeks ago. Gerald had been at work in the orchard since 5:30, and she could see the smoke from the burn pile in the south clearing. She sent Sylvia Teague's number to Dennis. Then she went outside. The days had acquired a shape, which was one of the things Ruth had not expected, and which mattered more than she would have predicted. In the 48 years of her marriage, she had lived according to the schedule of the school year and the piano lesson calendar, and the weekly rhythms of a house in a neighborhood. The orchard imposed different rhythms, earlier mornings, longer physical days, a sequence of tasks that were dependent on weather and season and the state of the trees, which did not care about calendars. Gerald was in the orchard by 5:30 every morning. He worked row by row, from the south end north, methodically and without hurry. The corrective pruning was a multi-visit process for each tree, not a single intervention, and he had planned the schedule across the growing season to hit each tree at the right moment in its development. He burned the removed wood in a clearing 50 feet from the nearest standing tree. He made notes in his field book. He came in for lunch at noon and went back out at 1:30 and came in at 5. Ruth's days were parallel in structure. She had established the well pump, replaced the pressure tank, cleaned and organized the kitchen, inventoried the barn. In the second week of May, she found, in a wooden crate beneath the pressing boards at the back of the equipment barn, a leather-bound notebook in her father's handwriting. It was a harvest log, covering the years 1983 through 2006. Every harvest, year by year, recorded in columns, variety, date-pressed, gallons of juice, gallons of finished cider, notes on the season, notes on the flavor. The handwriting was her father's, small and careful, the school teacher's hand, and the notes were precise in the way that a man who had worked with numbers his whole life makes notes. The 1999 entry said the Kingston Blacks were the best he had pressed. The 2004 entry said the Foxwhelps had surpassed all expectation. The 2006 entry ended mid-sentence in October, and the rest of the pages were blank. Ruth sat with that notebook for a long time. She read it the way she read anything important, not quickly, not looking for the conclusion, but following the sequence of it as it was written, year by year, watching the shape of a man's intention accumulate across 2 decades of harvest seasons. Her father had been paying attention to these trees for his entire adult life. He had been watching them develop. He had been making notes. He had been preparing for something he did not live long enough to finish. She put the notebook on the table next to the coffee tin. The cidery licensing application went to the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission in the third week of May, prepared by Sylvia Teague's office, and submitted with the supporting documentation of active farm use, operational equipment, and titled ownership. The operating name was Marsh Orchard Cider Company. Ruth had written it in the notebook before she wrote it anywhere official, in the same handwriting her father used, to see how it looked on the page. It looked correct. The county assessor's office visited on May 19th. The records clerk who came was a woman of about 50, who drove a county pickup, and who spent 40 minutes at the property, walking the access road, noting the equipment in the barn, looking at the orchard, and writing in the official log that the property at 4471 Elkton Road, Douglas County, was currently occupied by the titled owner, actively maintained, with evidence of ongoing agricultural use. Sylvia Teague called Ruth on May 22nd. "You're on record," she said. "County documentation of active occupation and agricultural use by the titled owner. Any transfer attempt by a third party at this point is not merely legally difficult, it's specifically fraudulent. Craig Marsh made representations to a developer about a property he had no authority to sell. That is his problem, not yours." "Has the developer contacted you?" Ruth asked. "Not yet, but I expect they'll contact Craig Marsh's counsel fairly quickly once they understand the situation. That is going to be an unpleasant conversation for Craig." Ruth said, "Has Dennis contacted you?" "He has. He asked some questions. I answered the ones I could answer in general terms and referred him to his own attorney for the rest." Sylvia paused. "He sounded like a man who has realized he was talked into something and is now trying to work out what his exposure is. He followed Craig's lead because the logic sounded familiar to him," Ruth said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Sylvia said. "It doesn't." The first 10 trees came down in May. Gerald worked alone on most of them, cutting them with a chainsaw at the base, and then clearing the debris by hand, branch by branch, to the burn pile. The 2 trees near the fence line he could not safely fell alone, a Kingston black and a foxwhelp, both leaning toward the wire, both requiring a rope-guided cut to keep them from taking out the fence on the way down. For those 2, he asked Vernon Hatch. Vernon came on a Saturday. He arrived at 7 in the morning in his farm truck and went straight to the orchard without stopping at the house. Gerald had the ropes already run. They felled both trees by 9, clean, with the stumps left at a height that Gerald could handle with the rented grinder, which he did the following Tuesday. He replanted 3 of the 10 cleared sites immediately. 2-year-old Kingston black grafts from a nursery in McMinnville, which he had identified through a connection he still had at the county extension office. The other 7 sites he left open to increase light penetration for the adjacent trees. He marked each of the new plantings in his field book. By the middle of June, the 62 remaining trees were responding. The corrective pruning had opened the canopies and redirected the energy that had been going into dead wood and crossing branches. Gerald walked the orchard at the end of June with his notebook and spent a full day counting the developing fruitlets on a systematic sample of 12 trees. He did the arithmetic at the table that evening and told Ruth the yield projection for the fall. Ruth wrote it down. "The press," she said. "Vernon and I ran it last Tuesday," Gerald said, "start to finish. It works. The seal's held. Then we press in October. October is right," Gerald said. 3rd week. "After the foxwhelps are fully mature. If we rush the foxwhelps, we lose the tannins." Ruth looked at the numbers on the page. She looked at the harvest log, Open to the 1999 entry, her father's handwriting describing the Kingston Blacks that year in terms that made it clear he had been moved by what the press had done with them. She said, "Year 3 yield, if everything goes as you're projecting. 350 to 400 gallons, Gerald said, at $12 to $15 a 500 milliliter bottle in direct retail." Ruth did the arithmetic without a calculator. She had been doing arithmetic in her head since she was 7 years old, one of the things her father had insisted on. She wrote the number down and showed it to Gerald. He looked at it for a moment. "Not nothing," he said. "No," Ruth said. "Not nothing at all." It was in July that Patrice called. She called on a Wednesday morning, which was not her usual call day. Patrice tended to call on Sundays, when the hospital was quieter, and she had managed the week's crises. A Wednesday call meant something was pressing. Her voice had the quality Ruth recognized from the way Patrice had sounded at 14, when she had done something she knew was wrong and was managing her way toward an explanation that covered it. She was 42 now, and the voice had the same underlying quality, better managed, but not entirely concealed. "Craig says the developer's attorney has been in contact with his firm," Patrice said. He says there are exposure issues." "There are," Ruth said. He's suggesting that if the property transfer had proceeded, the developer would have had a claim. "He's saying the delay has created a problem for Patrice," Ruth said. "Craig told a developer he could deliver a sale on land he had no authority to sell. Whatever problem that is created for him is a problem between Craig and the developer. It has nothing to do with us." A pause. "But if you had agreed to sell, I was never asked," Ruth said. "I overheard a conversation about a sale being arranged without my knowledge. That is a different situation." She paused. "What I want to know is when you were going to tell us." The silence that followed that question was longer than the other silences. "We thought Craig made it sound like it was a straightforward, 'I need you to hear me clearly,'" Ruth said. "This is my father's land. He chose the trees. He found the press. He maintained both of them for his entire adult life. He left them to me. I have paid the taxes for 27 years. At no point did I indicate that I wanted to sell, and at no point did you ask." She was at the kitchen window. The orchard was in summer fullness now, the canopies green and open, the fruit visible in the rows. Whatever Craig told you about what was straightforward, he was describing a transaction that would have required my consent and that he had every reason to know he could not obtain. "I know," Patrice said, very quietly. "I'm glad you do," Ruth said. She sent Patrice a link to the Marsh Orchard Cider Company's pending license page on the OLC Public Registry. Then she went back to work. The cidery license came through on August 17th. Ruth called Gerald in from the orchard when the email arrived. He came to the kitchen, looked at the screen over her shoulder, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your father should have done this 30 years ago." Ruth said, "He was too busy teaching. So were you." "So was I," Ruth said. He went back to the orchard. Ruth printed the license and put it in the file with the deed and the tax receipts and her father's harvest log. That same week, she drove to the Farm Supply Co-op in Roseburg and ordered 2 stainless steel fermentation tanks, used, sourced through a winery in the Willamette Valley that was upgrading its equipment. They were 80-gallon variable capacity tanks, professional grade, which had cost her $1,800 each at the auction, and which Gerald and Vernon moved into the equipment barn on a Saturday morning using a furniture dolly and a great deal of patience and a vocabulary of precise, quiet profanity that neither of them directed at the tanks or at each other, but only at the physics of the situation. The tanks were positioned against the east barn wall, under the window. When the afternoon light came through the glass, it caught the steel surface of both tanks and made the barn feel different, purposeful and operational, in a way that the old equipment barn had been building toward since April. Gerald said, "Your father would have bought these the first winter." Ruth said, "He didn't have the money the first winter." "How do you know?" She pointed at the harvest log, open on the work table to the 1983 entry, which included a line about equipment costs that suggested cash was short that year. Gerald read the line. "Fair enough," he said. They ran the first cleaning cycle on the tanks the following Thursday, which was a procedural requirement of the license, documented sanitation protocol before first use. Ruth ran it herself, following the written procedures she had prepared, recording the time and temperature and chemical concentrations in the production log she had started the day the license came through. She was methodical about it in the way she had always been methodical about the things that mattered, not from anxiety, but from the understanding that consistency is what separates an operation from an experiment. August was a warm month in the Umpqua Valley. The fruit was developing well. Gerald walked the orchard every Monday and took notes on the ripening progression by variety. The foxwhelps colored early, as they always did, turning from green to a dull red that would deepen through September. The Kingston blacks lagged behind in color, but Gerald said that was correct. They matured from the inside out, and color was a lagging indicator with that variety. The Yarlington Mills, the ones he had brought back from the worst condition of any tree in the orchard, were setting fruit for the first time in years, small and dense, the way Yarlington fruit always was. He showed Ruth how to assess ripeness by the starch iodine test, using test kits he had ordered from the extension office. He showed her the bruise pressure test, pressing his thumb against a sample fruit and reading the give. He showed her the refractometer that measured sugar content in the juice and how to read the Brix scale, the specific sugar level at which each variety was ready to press. Ruth learned all of this in the same way she had learned everything that mattered, which was by doing it with someone who knew it, and by paying close attention to what she was told. By September, she could walk the orchard herself and make the assessments that Gerald had been making. She was not as fast as he was, and she did not have the 36 years of instinct that lived in his hands. But she was accurate. The numbers she brought back from the orchard matched his within a margin he considered acceptable. He told her so, without making anything of it, which was how he told her the things that mattered most. Vernon Hatch came out the first Saturday of September, and the three of them walked the orchard together. And Vernon contributed what he knew from 31 years of tree fruit in the same valley, the microclimate variations he had observed, the frost pockets, the drainage patterns that affected the east end of the marsh planting differently from the west. It was the kind of conversation that happened between people who had been paying attention to the same piece of ground from different angles for a long time, and Ruth understood that Vernon had been paying attention to her father's orchard long before she arrived, in the way that people who care about land will quietly monitor the land adjacent to their own, not from possessiveness, but from the same impulse that makes a person check on a neighbor who lives alone. She was glad he had been watching. Diane Wu came to the orchard in September, introduced by Vernon Hatch, who had worked with her through a Lane County agricultural cooperative, and whose judgment Ruth had come to trust more fully than she had expected to in the 5 months since he had appeared at the farmhouse door with his cap in his hand. Diane Wu was a compact and methodical woman of about 50, who ran a specialty food supply operation in Eugene, serving 14 restaurants in the Willamette Valley and Southern Coast. She sourced from small producers. She paid fair prices. She had, according to Vernon, turned down 4 times as many suppliers as she had accepted, and what she could not stand was inconsistency. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in a practical sedan, and walked the orchard with Gerald without speaking very much. She looked at the trees the way someone looks at trees who has looked at a great number of them. She crouched at one point and pressed her thumb into the soil between rows and rubbed it between her fingers. She stopped at the Kingston Blacks and spent longer there than at any other variety. In the barn, she looked at the press for a long time. Rack and cloth, she said. 1962, Gerald said. Austrian, Villach. She looked at the pressing boards, at the cloths, at the hydraulic cylinder. How many of your Kingston Blacks are mature trees? She said. 11. 3 more are 2-year grafts, not in production yet. She turned to Ruth. What's your first production run? 150 gallons. We press the 3rd week of October. Diane Wu said, I want all of it. Ruth said, You haven't heard the price. Tell me the price. The price Ruth named, which she had arrived at through 3 weeks of research into small-batch artisan cider markets in Oregon and California, made Diane Wu nod once, in the way professional buyers nod when a price is fair and they want to take it before the seller reconsiders. She said, I'll need a year 2 commitment if year 1 is what I think it's going to be. Ruth said, year 2 we expect to triple the volume. That's what I thought, Diane Wu said. They shook hands at the kitchen table over coffee. The coffee tin was still on the table. Diane Wu noticed it and did not say anything about it, which Ruth appreciated. The first press run was on a Thursday in the 3rd week of October. Gerald ran the press. Ruth managed the intake table, which her father had built from 2x12 fir planks on a welded steel frame, sorting the fruit by hand as it came off the harvest bins, removing the damaged and undersized fruit, checking the condition of each load, making the final call on which fruit went to the press. It was the kind of work she had not done before, and which turned out to use the same skills as teaching, the ability to assess quickly, to make consistent decisions without second-guessing them, to hold a standard against a moving situation. Vernon Hatch was there. Diane Wu drove from Eugene and arrived at 9 in the morning and stayed until the pressing was done. Gerald ran the press from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and by 4 they had pressed 162 gallons of juice, which ran from the press into the stainless tanks through a hose that Gerald had fitted with a flow meter so they could track the yield in real time. Vernon Hatch stood at the barn door watching the last run come through. Alden would have liked today, he said. Ruth was at the utility sink, washing the pressing cloths by hand the way the press manual specified. He would have asked what took us so long, she said. Vernon Hatch laughed, a short sound, genuine, without anything managed about it. Yes, he said. He would have asked exactly that. Diane Wu was at the collection tank, watching the flow meter. You're going to finish at 160, she said. 62, Gerald said. At your price, that's a good day, Diane Wu said. It was a good day. Ruth knew it was a good day and did not say so, because saying so felt like announcing something that was still only a beginning. Craig Marsh arrived on a Tuesday in October, the week after the first press run. He came in a black Audi that he parked on the road because the farm gate was open and the yard was occupied by the farm truck and the equipment mover they had borrowed from Vernon for the season. He walked in on foot, which meant he had to navigate the newly graded access road and the gap in the blackberry canes where the clearing had been done in April, which was no longer a gap, but a properly cut edge, maintained. He stopped at the edge of the equipment yard. The barn door was open. Through the doorway, the Steyr press was visible, positioned on the barn floor with the pressing boards in their rack and the collection tray clean and empty. On the outside barn wall, a cedar sign had been mounted, cut and painted by a sign maker in Roseburg, the letters Clean and Deep Marsh Orchard Cider Company. The yard itself was clear. The gate hardware was new. The house porch had a new rail section where the old one had rotted out. Craig stood and looked at all of this for a moment. He was still in the suit jacket and the fleece vest. He had parked on the road rather than drive in, which meant he had walked the 200 yards of gravel access road in shoes that were not made for gravel. He had seen the sign from the road. He had seen it clearly enough that he had stopped walking for a moment before continuing. Gerald came out of the barn. He was carrying a pruning saw in his right hand and loppers in his left because he had been in the orchard before Craig arrived and had not put anything down. He stopped at the barn door. The two men looked at each other across the yard. Craig said, "Mr. Calloway, I was hoping to speak with Ruth. She's inside," Gerald said. He did not walk toward Craig. He did not put down the tools. Craig looked at the sign on the barn wall. He looked at the 2 cases of bottled cider on the pallet near the barn entrance, the first 48 bottles of the first production run, labeled with Vernon's hand-drawn label, stacked for pickup by Diane Wu's driver at the end of the week. "You've done considerable work here," Craig said. He said it carefully. The way a man says something he needs to be able to claim was a compliment. "Yes," Gerald said. There was a beat of silence. Gerald was looking at Craig with the uncomplicated attention of a man who had spent his career assessing the structural state of things. Craig shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "The cidery that's a significant undertaking," Craig said. "For a property in this condition, the property was in good condition when we arrived," Gerald said. "You told the developer it was derelict and unused. You did that without ever having been here." Craig's mouth closed. He opened it again. "The information I had was wrong," Gerald said, "because you did not check it. You assumed, and you represented the assumption as fact to a buyer in a commercial transaction." He shifted the pruning saw to his left hand alongside the loppers and put both hands at his sides. "The land is Ruth's. It has been in her name since 2001. She has paid the property taxes for 27 years. She did not authorize a sale. She did not establish a power of attorney. She did not indicate to anyone that the property was available." He paused. "You arranged a transaction that required her consent and proceeded without obtaining it." Craig looked at the sign. He looked at the press inside the barn. He looked at the orchard behind the house. 62 trees in the October light, the harvest done, the canopies clean and open against the sky. He looked at the labeled bottles on the pallet. He said, "The developer's attorney has been in contact with my firm." "I know," Gerald said. "Sylvia Teague told us. She's been copied on the correspondence." That was the moment, not dramatic, just the physical fact of it. Craig had not known that Sylvia Teague was on the correspondence. He had known she was the Calloway's attorney. He had not known how closely she had been tracking the developer's position. The calculation that had already been failing now closed completely. He said, "My exposure, what I told them about the property's status, is a matter between you and the developer and between you and your own counsel," Gerald said. "We're not part of that." A longer silence. Craig said, "Could I speak to Ruth?" Gerald called through the kitchen door without moving from where he was standing. Ruth came to the step. She stood on the top step and looked across the yard at Craig Marsh, who was standing in the October afternoon light 20 feet away with his hands no longer in his pockets, but at his sides, which was where hands go when the options have run out. She said, "Craig." He said, "Ruth. I'd hoped we could know." She said. She said it without inflection, without emphasis. The word had no heat in it. "I'd like you to leave the property now." Craig looked at her. He looked at Gerald. He looked at the sign on the barn wall, at the name Marsh, which was his name too, or had been since he was 22. and which was on this sign because it had always belonged here. He said, "Right." He turned and walked back to the road. His footsteps on the gravel were the only sound for a moment. The Audi started. It reversed onto the county road and drove north. Ruth watched until the sound of it was gone completely. She went back inside. The coffee she had left on the table was still warm. She sat down and picked it up and held it and looked out the kitchen window at the orchard. Dennis came in November on a Saturday morning without calling first. Ruth had been expecting this, not the exact date, but the form of it. Dennis had always been the one who showed up when the accounting was done, the one who came in person rather than on the phone, because he needed to see what he was accounting to. He drove in and parked beside the farm truck and sat in the car for a moment before he got out. Ruth watched him from the kitchen window. He was wearing his old barn coat, a canvas Carhartt from his early 30s that he had kept for the kind of weekend tasks that required something he could get dirty. She had not seen him wear it in a long time. She did not know if he had put it on deliberately or simply reached for it. But she noticed it. He came to the kitchen door. Ruth let him in. She did not hug him. She poured him coffee and set it on the table. He sat down. He wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at the coffee tin and at the harvest log, which was open to the 2004 entry. He looked at the window and at the orchard beyond it. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom." Ruth sat down across from him. "I know," she said. "I thought Craig made it seem like a reasonable." "I know what Craig made it seem like," Ruth said. "He is very good at making things seem reasonable." Dennis was quiet. "I should have asked you," he said, "before any of it. I should have called you and asked if you had any intention for the land." "Yes," Ruth said, "you should have." He looked at the harvest log. "Is that Grandpa's?" "His harvest records," Ruth said, 1983 to 2006. Dennis looked at it without touching it. "We're pressing in the third week of every October," Ruth said. "If you want to come out for the next one, you're welcome. There's work to do." Dennis looked at her. "I don't know anything about orchards," he said. Ruth said, "Your father does." Gerald was at the kitchen door. He had come in from the orchard without Ruth hearing him. She had been focused on Dennis. He set his work bag down and looked at his son. Dennis said, "Dad." Gerald said, "Dennis." They looked at each other for a moment, the way fathers and sons look at each other after the kind of event that can't be fully discussed and so has to be held between them in a more general form. Gerald said, "We're starting the winter pruning in January. It's detailed work. I could use a second pair of hands." Dennis looked at his own hands, around the coffee mug. "These hands haven't done that kind of work in, I know," Gerald said. "I'll show you." November light came low across the orchard in the afternoons, cold and gold and nearly level with the ground, the way light gets in the Pacific Northwest when the sun drops south and you feel the full weight of the season. The trees were bare now, all leaves down, the structure fully visible. 62 trees in their rows, the old ones and the new grafts together, the canopies open and correctly shaped after a full season of corrective work. You could see, with the leaves down, exactly what they were, an orchard that had been neglected and brought back, and that was now entering winter with something to offer the following spring. Ruth was on the porch with her coffee when Dennis came out of the house and stood on the step below her. He looked at the orchard for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "He planted good trees." Ruth said, "He knew what he was doing." Gerald came around the corner of the house from the direction of the equipment barn, carrying the pruning saw he had been sharpening. He stopped at the porch step and looked at the two of them, and then at the orchard. He sat down on the step beside Dennis. He set the saw across his knees The three of them sat there in the November light and did not speak for a while. A red-tailed hawk moved across the south end of the orchard and disappeared into the tree line at the field edge. The bare branches of the 62 trees stood against the pale afternoon sky. The Marsh orchard sign was visible from the porch, fixed to the barn wall. The cedar had already begun to silver at the edges in the autumn weather. It would look better in 2 years than it did today. The way cedar always does, the weathering is not damage. It is the wood becoming itself. Ruth's coffee was warm in her hands. The porch boards were solid under their feet. Through the open barn door, the stair press stood in the interior, ready for the season to come. The orchard her father had planted in 1961 extended in its rows south of the house, 60 years old and brought back, each tree in its place. It had not gone anywhere. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment. What would you have done in Ruth and Gerald's position?